There's $1 million math prize that's been sitting unclaimed for over 20 years, 7 of the hardest problems in the world, and in all that time, only one of them has ever been solved. But the man who solved it turned the money down, and that's not even the strange part, because before he vanished into a small apartment in Russia to live with his mother, this man told a reporter that he already knew how to control the universe. So why, he asked, should he run for $1 million? This is the story of Grigory Perelman, the genius who cracked a problem that had beaten the smartest people on the planet for 100 years, and then walked away from everything the world tried to give him for it. Let me start with the problem itself, because you can't understand how strange this man is until you understand how impossible the thing he solved really was. It begins in the year 2000. The world's leading mathematicians gathered in Paris at the Collège de France to do something audacious. They wanted to name the most important unsolved problems in all of mathematics. A nonprofit called the Clay Mathematics Institute organized the meeting, and they put real money behind it, $1 million to the first person who could solve any one of 7 problems. They called them the Millennium Prize problems. These weren't homework questions. They were the deepest mysteries in the field, the kind of thing entire careers get poured into and come up empty. And to this day, more than 2 decades later, only a single one of those 7 has been solved. The one that fell is called the Poincare conjecture, and it had already been tormenting mathematicians for nearly a century before that meeting in Paris ever happened. Back in 1904, a French mathematician named Henri Poincare posed a question about the fundamental nature of space. Now, I'm going to explain this without the heavy jargon, because the idea underneath it is actually beautiful. There's a branch of math called topology, and topologists have a very loose definition of when 2 shapes are the same. To a topologist, a ball and a pillow are the same object, because you could reshape one into the other without tearing it or cutting it. Just squish and stretch, same thing. But here's where it gets fun. A coffee mug and a donut are also considered the same. Why? Because each of them has exactly one hole. The hole in the donut, the hole in the mug's handle. You could, in principle, mold one smoothly into the other. So to a topologist, they're identical, even though they look nothing alike, and even though neither of them is a sphere. What Poincare suggested was this. Take any 3-dimensional shape that has no holes in it at all. Something finite. Something that doesn't stretch off into infinity. He claimed that any shape like that is secretly just a sphere in disguise. A blob with no holes could be reshaped into a sphere. Anything without holes, he said, is equivalent to a sphere. He was convinced this was true. He just couldn't prove it. And that's the cruel thing about mathematics. Believing isn't enough. You have to prove it with absolute certainty, or it's just a guess. So the conjecture sat there, and over the decades, other mathematicians tried to generalize it to higher dimensions, 4 dimensions, 5, and higher. And here's the part that drove everyone crazy. Those higher dimensional versions actually got solved. One by one, they fell. The 4-dimensional case, famously difficult, eventually cracked. The cases above it cracked too. But the original, the plain 3-dimensional version that Poincare actually asked about in 1904, that one refused to die. For a full century, it broke every mathematician who came at it. It became one of the most notorious unsolved problems in the history of the subject. And then, in 2002, something quiet and strange happened. A paper simply appeared on the internet. It was posted to a website called arXiv, which is a public forum operated out of Cornell University, where researchers upload their work for anyone to read. No journal, no press release, no build-up, just a paper sitting there, like a note left on a doorstep. And inside that paper was a solution to the Poincare conjecture. The author was a Russian mathematician named Grigory Perelman. To the people who knew him, he was Grisha, and the story of who he was is almost harder to believe than the proof he'd just delivered. Grisha grew up in the Soviet Union and attended an elite high school in St. Petersburg that specialized in mathematics. Even among a room full of gifted kids, he stood out, and not in the way you'd expect. He wasn't louder or flashier. He was the opposite. He never got distracted. He didn't goof around. He just sat and listened and absorbed. Classmates remembered that he wouldn't even stop to eat his lunch. One of his teachers, a man named Valery Ricci, later told the author Masha Gessen, who wrote a whole book about Perelman called Perfect Rigor, that it was was as if his entire nervous system was tuned so perfectly to the act of learning that he physically could not pull himself away from it. At 16 years old, he won a gold medal at the International Mathematical Olympiad. Not just a medal, a perfect score. Flawless. That score opened a door that mattered enormously. Being on the Soviet Olympiad team meant he could be admitted to Leningrad State University without sitting the entrance exams. And that was significant for a reason that has nothing to do with math. The university was notoriously discriminatory. It admitted only 2 Jewish students per year, but Grisha's place on the national team let him bypass that quota entirely. After his studies, he did graduate work at the renowned Steklov Mathematical Institute at its St. Petersburg branch, which at the time was almost unheard of for a Jewish mathematician. He got in because influential people recognized what he was. A famous mathematician named Alexander Alexandrov campaigned on his behalf and personally offered to supervise him. He began that graduate work in 1987, right as the Iron Curtain was beginning to lift. For the first time in decades, Soviet citizens could travel abroad, and a celebrated mathematician named Mikhail Gromov arranged for Grisha to come give talks in the United States about geometry, which was his specialty. Gromov whispered his name to the right people, and soon Grisha was invited to do postdoctoral work at some of the best institutions in America. NYU's current institute, Stony Brook University. There's a small detail from this period that tells you everything about him. While he was in New York, one of his great pleasures was walking. He would walk all the way from Manhattan down into South Brooklyn just to buy a particular kind of black bread from a Russian shop. That was the indulgence. A long walk and the right loaf of bread. He later moved to the West Coast for a prestigious Miller Fellowship at UC Berkeley, and by now the mathematics world was paying attention. This was clearly an extraordinary talent, so when his fellowship ended, the most elite universities on earth started circling, trying to recruit him. And this is where you start to see the man he really was. Princeton was so impressed by a guest lecture he gave that they approached him about becoming an assistant professor. They asked him to send his CV, his resume, standard procedure, and Grisha reportedly replied, "Why would you need any more information?" In his mind, if they knew his work, the work spoke for itself. The paperwork was beneath the question. According to Masha Gessen's book, the real issue was that Grisha wouldn't accept anything less than a tenured position, a permanent senior post. But the university wanted this 29-year-old to earn his way there first, the way everyone else did, so he refused Princeton's offer outright. Then Tel Aviv University, where his own sister was studying mathematics, offered him a full professorship. He turned that down too. He said he could simply work better back home. And so he returned to Russia, to the Steklov Institute. And there, he went quiet. Nobody knew what he was working on. He'd essentially withdrawn into himself. What he was working on in that silence was the impossible problem, the one that had defeated 100 years of geniuses. He was quietly tackling the Poincare conjecture. So how did he actually do it? How do you solve something that has broken everyone before you? The answer is that he didn't attack it directly. He came at it sideways by proving a different, even broader idea. Back in the late 1970s, an American mathematician named William Thurston had suggested that any three-dimensional shape could be broken down into 8 fundamental geometric building blocks. And one of those 8 building blocks was the three-dimensional sphere, the very thing sitting at the heart of Poincare's question. Thurston, brilliant as he was, never managed to prove his own idea. Another American, Richard Hamilton, took a run at both Thurston's and Poincare's conjectures. He couldn't finish either, but this matters, he developed the blueprint that Grisha would eventually use to crack the whole thing open. That blueprint centered on a powerful mathematical tool called ricci flow. Let me give you a way to picture it. Imagine heat spreading through an object. As it spreads, it smooths everything out. Bumps flatten, irregularities relax. The whole shape becomes more even over time. Ricci flow does something like that to geometric shapes. It smooths them. But there was a problem that had stopped Hamilton cold. As the flow progressed, certain regions would pinch and stretch into thin spots, almost like narrow necks forming in the shape. And those necks tangled everything up. Hamilton got stuck there for 2 decades. Grisha's solution was both brutal and elegant. When one of those necks formed, he simply cut it off. He literally called this step surgery. He'd slice away the problem region and study the clean pieces that remained, each one on its own. And what he discovered was that those pieces ultimately corresponded to the simple, fundamental shapes that Thurston had predicted all those years ago. So by proving Thurston's conjecture, he had, in one stroke, also proven Poincare's. The work was monstrous dangerous in scale. 3 papers, 992 pages in total, and when he uploaded the first one to that public forum, he sent a quiet email to about a dozen American mathematicians, just to give them a heads up. This was completely out of the blue. He hadn't really spoken to these former colleagues in years. He'd barely answered their emails, and now, suddenly, here was the solution to a century-old problem dropped into their inboxes without ceremony. It was so dense, so radical that mathematicians spent more than 3 years scrutinizing every line just trying to confirm that he had actually done it. But one person was conspicuously silent, Richard Hamilton, the very man whose foundational work Grisha had built upon, and Grisha was genuinely hurt by this. Hamilton showed almost no interest in the achievement that rested on his own ideas. Grisha told the New Yorker that he had the impression Hamilton had only read the first part of his paper, and maybe you can understand why. As Masha Gessen put it took Perelman less than half of his very first paper to sail past the exact point where Hamilton had been stuck for 20 years. No wonder Hamilton went quiet. Imagine spending your life chasing something, getting stuck, and then watching a stranger with unkempt hair and long fingernails not only catch up but blow straight through the wall you'd been banging your head against for 2 decades. Eventually, the mathematicians who were more enthusiastic got their chance to meet Grisha in person when he was invited to lecture at several American universities, and by 2006, the verdict was in. He had genuinely solved the Poincare conjecture. Now there was a brief, confusing twist. 2 Chinese mathematicians, Cao Huaidong and Zhu Xiping, published work claiming they had proved the Poincare conjecture, calling it a crowning achievement. But the mathematics community was clear. The crown belonged to Grisha, and Grisha alone. And here is where this stops being a story about a math problem and becomes a story about a man unlike almost anyone you'll ever hear about. Because he turned down the $1 million. He just refused it. The money the Clay Institute had promised, the prize for solving one of the 7 hardest problems on Earth. He said no. Money, it turned out, had never been the point for him at all. And it wasn't just the money. In 2006, he was awarded the Fields Medal. If you don't know what that is, it's the highest honor in all of mathematics, often described as the equivalent of the Nobel Prize. People wait their whole lives for it. He didn't even show up to the ceremony in Madrid to collect it. The man presenting it had to stand there and announce with regret that Dr. Perelman had declined to accept the medal. Grisha later explained to the Telegraph that he simply wasn't interested in the attention. He said he didn't think anything he had to say could be of the slightest public interest. He said that self-promotion happened all the time, and if people wanted to do that, fine. Good luck to them, but he didn't regard it as a positive thing. He even said newspapers should be more discerning about who they write about, that they should have more taste. That was one of the only interviews he ever gave. He had no patience for journalists poking into his life. There's a famous story that when a reporter finally managed to reach him on the phone, Grisha cut him off and said, "You are disturbing me. I am picking mushrooms." And the offers kept coming. MIT, Princeton, Columbia, all of them tried to bring him in. The mathematician and investor Jim Simons, who had built Stony Brook's math department into one of the best in the country, and who later became a billionaire, reportedly offered Grisha any salary he wanted, on any terms he wanted, name it. He refused. And in the spring of 2004, he returned to Russia. He went back to the Steklov Institute where he was promoted to lead researcher on a salary of around $400 a month. $400 a month for one of the greatest mathematical minds alive. And his integrity here was almost absurd. There was an occasion when he was paid nearly double his usual salary because his lab had some leftover grant money sitting around after a project finished. Grisha insisted that the extra money be returned to the accounting office. He didn't want what he hadn't earned. When he was asked in the end about the prize money he'd refused, he gave the line that haunts this whole story. He told a Russian newspaper, "I know how to control the universe. So tell me, why should I run for $1 million?" And then, in December of 2005, he left the Steklov Institute altogether. As the author Gessen recounts it, he told the institute's director something like this: "I have nothing against the people here, but I have no friends, and anyway, I have been disappointed in mathematics, and I want to try something else. I quit." And he meant it. He didn't just withdraw from mathematics. He withdrew from public life almost entirely. To this day, very little is known about what he's done since, except that he lived with his mother. A photograph surfaced online not long ago of a man who appears to be Grisha, looking disheveled, completely removed from the honors and the fortune he had so deliberately refused. And as for that $1 million he wouldn't take, the Clay Institute didn't just keep it. They used his prize money to fund something called the Poincare chair. Poincare, a temporary position for young, promising mathematicians at the Henri Poincare Institute in Paris. So in a strange way, the prize he rejected is still out there, quietly funding the next generation of minds, people who will never get the chance to thank him. Grisha's story sits in this strange and powerful place. On one side, it shows the absolute ceiling of human intelligence, what one focused mind is capable of when it refuses to be distracted by anything, even lunch. And on the other side, it's a complete rejection of everything the world insists that intelligence is supposed to be for. The fame, the money, the titles, the prestige. He solved the unsolvable, and the only reward he seemed to want was to be left alone. Maybe he was right. Maybe a man who can hold the shape of the universe in his head really doesn't need $1 million, or a medal, or his name in the paper. Or maybe the rest of us are just measuring the wrong things. Either way, somewhere in Russia, a man who could control the universe decided that picking mushrooms in peace was worth more than anything we could offer him. And honestly, it's hard to say he was wrong. Share.